I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me a returning guest and a regular contributor to the Prospector News, Ted Butler. Welcome back, Ted.
Thank you for having me, Mike. Always good to do this and continue this series that we've started.
Yeah, for those that weren't aware, we've been running a series looking at the electrification of the transportation system. Our first part of that was back in May when we looked at the planes element of the planes, trains, and automobiles trifecta. And our July issue, we looked at the trains part of the planes, trains, and automobiles trifecta. So let's start talking about that. So, exactly how green are trains and how much carbon is actually produced by the railway industry?
Yeah, so it's a really good place to start. Trains are pretty much as green as it gets when it comes to transportation methods. I think rail only accounts for 1% of global transport emissions, with a relatively inconsequential 94.64 million tons of direct CO2 emissions produced in 2022, which is the latest figures available. Further to that, rail also has the lowest emissions versus other transport options on what's called a well-to-wheel basis, which is a term from the IEA that describes the total greenhouse gas emissions produced throughout the entire life cycle of a vehicle's fuel. As an example, air travel, which we covered in our previous podcast, Mike, averages 5 times more emissions than rail on a per passenger kilometre basis. It actually produces around 1/3 of the next least polluting transport method, which is buses. So it's by far the least polluting as far as CO2 is concerned. And this superior greenness, if you want to call it that, is because 85% of global passenger rail activity and 55% of global freight movements are powered by electricity, which of course means zero direct emissions. But that's not to say that rail emissions are completely free, as roughly 70% of electric rail produces indirect emissions due to a reliance on non-renewable electricity sources. And not to mention as well, diesel locomotives are still commonplace across the US, Asia, and Africa in particular. But the bottom line is that more trains will be needed if this green energy transition is to really follow through. And we're already seeing some evidence of that with the various infrastructure projects that are being embarked upon.
Yeah, you and I are a bit of a dichotomy when it comes to the rail industry because you're located over in Europe. I'm located over here in North America, and the rail industries in both these areas are vastly, completely different. You're almost, and I would suggest you are 100% electrified in Europe, where we have very little electric train activity here in North America. It's all powered by diesel locomotives. So it's more of a greenhouse factor here in North America than it is in Europe. Am I correct?
Absolutely, yeah. Europe is a very much a small continent, so there's of course much easier to roll out rail infrastructure and achieve that sort of net zero quicker. There are, inherent psychological aspects of North American culture which makes people more inclined to drive, but I would imagine that's because of um, you know, the distances that would be required to roll out train infrastructure, and the efforts to do so are just simply too much because of how big America and Canada is. So yeah, you would be correct in that. But really what we're seeing, Mike, is the majority of rail infrastructure projects are actually coming from the east, much like the direction of the gold trade nowadays. China's leading the way when it comes to the rollout of rail infrastructure. I think it has 155,000 kilometers at the end of 2022 of rail network and 42,000 of high-speed rail, which is the largest in the world. And this has grown, 100-fold over the last 20 years, and it's set to actually expand further, the high-speed rail segment to 50,000 kilometers by 2025, which of course will come as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And what we tried to do in the article, what I tried to do, was to quantify how the metal consumption would be affected by the likes of these projects. And one of the flagship projects of the BRI is the Sichuan Tibet Railway, which is a high altitude line connecting Chengdu in Sichuan to Lhasa in Tibet. It involves just over 1,000 kilometers of railway numerous tunnels and bridges, and an estimated cost of just over $50 billion. Another one that's notable is the $58 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Railway, which links Pakistan's Gwadar port to Akshar in western China. And what we noticed in this research was that these projects are going to use an absolute load of copper, simply because of its electrical conductivity, its durability, and its resistance to corrosion. It's used in substations, transformers, bus bars, overhead catenary systems, signal cables, and actually, most notably, the railway track itself. So I crunched the numbers, and my estimates are that 2 to 5 tons of copper is used per every kilometre of electrified track. So this basically means the 1,000 kilometre Sichuan-Tibet railway track should have used somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 tons of copper once constructed, which for context is the equivalent of up to half of the 10,000 tons of copper held in the world's largest physical copper ETF, which is a Sprott investment vehicle, as you know. And it goes even further, Mike. This is only the copper consumption for the track of one standard electric railway. In actual fact, the copper consumption rises further for high-speed rail to 10 tons per kilometre of track. So based on these assumptions, the additional 8,000 kilometres of track needed to expand China's high-speed rail network to 50,000 kilometres by 2025 would require a further 80,000 tons of copper. So that's the main takeaway, was that, rail infrastructure is going to be incredibly copper intensive.
Yeah. Now, when you say expand, are they building new rail lines, or are they converting old rail lines that were maybe running on diesel to electric in China?
Yeah, so like I say, they have 155,000 kilometers of total rail network, and within that, 42,000 kilometers is high-speed rail. So they're trying to take the 42,000 kilometer of high-speed rail to 50,000 by 2025, so a further 8,000 kilometers. And that's really where the more copper-intensive applications are going to come in, because high-speed rail consumes more copper than just standard rail.
I see. So let's take then a look away from China into North America, where we have no electric rail lines.
Yeah.
The amount of copper that would be needed would be off the charts to convert that to an electric system. Or am I out to lunch? Like this, to convert North American railway to electricity seems like a fool's folly. Like it can't be done. We don't have enough copper to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, that's the first problem. And the second problem is there's simply nowhere near enough funding, even though the $44 billion in funding that was provided to Amtrak, the rail company subsidized and basically owned by the US government, was the most in all the 50 plus years of federal funding provided to Amtrak since their creation. With regard to federal subsidies, just for context, for highways, just showing you how dominated the US is by cars, they received over $240 billion of federal subsidies in 2021, which is almost 100 times the federal subsidies provided to rail infrastructure. And bear in mind that those subsidies provided to rail infrastructure were the highest they've been in 50 years. So even at record levels of rail investment, this is the thing, that the main problem is obviously the lack of copper and materials needed to actually roll out the infrastructure, but the funding is just exacerbates the problem, because despite the commitments, nobody's really serious about rolling out rail infrastructure in America. And there are pockets of places where it seems more likely, like you look to the California high-speed rail, which they say would connect San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, and be ready in time for the 2028 Olympics in LA. And God only knows what the opening ceremony would look like for that after what we just saw in France. But there are other reports saying that the project is $100 billion short, and that the timeline is wholly unrealistic. So I think certainly one of the things I've observed in this research is that the rail infrastructure rollout and the metals consumption for rail infrastructure will be dominated by the East, and not only China but India, which I'd like to talk about as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about India, and then we'll circle back to North America.
Yeah, so Prime Minister Modi been very, very vocal about rail infrastructure. He's actually, I'm not sure if he's funded the documentaries, but there's been numerous propaganda and promotions about trains and the future of a high-speed rail-powered India in the future. As part of this, the Indian government plans to operationalize 4,500 Vande Bharat semi-high-speed trains by 2047. Within that, the National High-Speed Rail Corporation in India are constructing a bullet train, which will allow passengers to travel from Mumbai to Ahmedabad at speeds of 320 kilometers an hour. This is supposed to be completed in 2027 and will span about 508 kilometers, consuming over 5,000 tons of copper in that high-speed rail alone. But the thing with India that's really interesting, Mike, as well, is how it's going to be powered, this electricity. For the rail, and silver is going to be a huge component. Just for context, silver roughly accounts for 685,000 ounces. That's what's required to generate 1 gigawatt of solar capacity. And then at the same time, you've got Indian Railways, which is the state-owned company responsible for the 4th largest train network in the world, which is India, has developed a mega plan to install 20 gigawatts of solar capacity as part of its goal of becoming net zero carbon emissions by 2030. So in short, this means that roughly 13.7 million ounces of silver would have been consumed by India's railways by 2030. But then with over 1,100 Indian railway stations having already been fitted with solar capacity, and with plans being explored to directly supply solar power to 1 in 4 trains via overhead lines, I think the reality is that this 13.7 is probably an underestimate. And when you connect the dots as well, Mike, when you look at the imports into India this year of silver, importing a record 70.7 million ounces in February 2024, which is the equivalent of 64% of the country's annual silver imports in 2023, and more silver than the US Mint produced in American silver eagle coins over the past 3 years combined. I think a lot of this silver that's being imported is probably going toward these infrastructure projects. I think it's a sign of further silver demand to come.
Yeah, that would seem to be a bit of a snapshot of the needs, and you're right. It seems to be more of an Eastern than a Western thing. Now, before we get back, work our way back into North America, what's happening in Europe? Is there plans for high-speed rail in Europe as well, or are they going to go? I've ridden on Euro through Romania when I was there last fall. It's a nice, peaceful way to travel, but it's not, it's not high-speed rail.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with a country that is technically not in Europe, but is my place of birth, which is the UK. Rishi Sunak made significant changes to the HS2 project, which is supposed to be, I think it would be probably the biggest in Europe if it was completed. He cancelled the northern leg of the HS2 plan, which was originally planned to extend from Birmingham to Manchester, which is my hometown. And then since then, we've had a new Labour Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, coming in, who said in 2021 that he would build HS2 in full, and now he's saying it's not possible to do certain parts of the railway. So this is one of the big problems in the UK, is just the lack of clarity and the lack of, this chopping and changing of decisions. Are we going to do it? Are we going to not? I think a lot of other European countries like France will probably fare a lot better. I think, but even then, I don't even think a lot of it will go ahead. I think a lot of it's just Macron, boasting about things that will never actually materialize. I think one of the plans is the Grand Paris Express in France is estimated to cost $31 billion, which would see, I think, 200 kilometers of new automated lines and 68 new stations added to the metro system. But again, it would require a significant expansion of the nation's electricity grid, which would, for France, mean more uranium, given that, of course, I think over 70% of France is powered by nuclear energy. But certainly, in answer to your question, I think Europe is definitely ahead of the game compared to like the US, for example. But a lot of the new demand for rail infrastructure is gonna come mostly from the east.
Okay. Now we'll slide our way back into North America because that's where I am. And the only high speed rail that I'm familiar with is the one we've discussed about in California. And it's not going well. And that's probably a grotesque understatement, but it's not going well. But I'd like to marry the concept of our last discussion about the airline industry with this concept for the the railway industry. And I'd like to frame this in two ways. One of the things that we talked about with the airline industry was electrification, and the conclusion was that it was probably more likely to see hydrogen powered aircraft than we were going to see electric powered aircraft. So that's the first question I would say, is that rather than electrifying our railway system in North America, is it more likely that we see a situation where we get rid of diesel powered engines for hydrogen engines?
Potentially, we are seeing evidence of that in other continents like Africa, where I think in Ethiopia there's a huge hydroelectric train that was rolled out there. But one of the problems in America with trains and the perception towards trains is that psychologically Americans are more inclined to drive. And they're more inclined to fly as well. And a lot of this goes back to historical marketing campaigns. I mean, I just mentioned it to you before, Mike. In 1987, there were plans to build a rail network in Texas that would mimic France's TGV system, but it ultimately failed in 1994 because Southwest Airlines spent $37 million on a marketing campaign convincing Texas farmers that a rail network would stop cows giving milk. So there's this kind of, whether you agree with it or not, it's obviously profit motivated from Southwest Airlines at the time. There is this kind of perception towards rail that's inherently negative in the US. And I think that's probably going to take a long time to change. And, there are, outside of California, there are like examples of, where they're trying to, electrify and move away from locomotives, to answer your question. The Midwest Chicago hub plans include new and upgraded high-speed rail services connecting Chicago to Indianapolis, Milwaukee, the Twin Cities, Detroit. Even in up in British Columbia, there's plans for this Cascadia high-speed rail corridor, which aims to connect Oregon, Washington, and BC. So there are plans, Mike, but I'm not convinced that they're going to follow through with them.
Yeah. So you kind of sort of answered the second part of this question, which was we talked about the airline industry and how to decarbonize that, and we had our discussions there. But I'm wondering if the answer to decarbonizing the airline industry is actually high speed rail, because you have a lot of, and I'm guilty of it. I had a lot of short flights this spring. There were little 1 hour jumps. From Toronto to Montreal, Montreal to New York, Montreal to Boston, Toronto to Boston, Toronto to Washington. If we put in high speed rail lines along these heavy populated corridors, say from Montreal to Toronto to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and through that part of the area, would we eliminate the need for airlines to service those destinations and thus cut back on the carbon footprint of the airline industry and have them concentrate in more longer haul flights?
I think you're absolutely correct. I think in theory that's a brilliant idea, and it would bring down global emissions, which is the target that all the corporations and governments seem to be pursuing. The problem is, like I say, there's this inherent psychological, for whatever reason, you know, obviously it can be changed. People can change the psychology, and people can get the train from Montreal to Toronto or wherever. And actually, if somewhere like the UK, for example, if I'm going to go from Manchester to London, as I will be doing in a few months' time, I'll get the train. There's no problem. It's kind of a cultural thing. It's quite normal. Whereas I feel like a similar distance in the US, it would be more natural to hop on a plane. So in theory, yes, absolutely, Mike. We should really be replacing those. If we're going to be really super green about this and eco warrior style about this, then we should be taking the train instead of flying on those short haul flights. But whether the American psyche is prepared for that or willing to do that is another matter.
Yeah, but at least your trains run on time.
Well, they don't. They often don't, Mike. That's the funny thing. Public services. So there's also that.
See, there I am, a victim of government propaganda. I was always told that the trains are on time in Britain.
Well, yeah, they're inconsistent. And we've had a lot of strikes as well, but that's a whole other issue about the UK political and economic system right now. And I think we'd have to save that for another day, Mike.
Wonderful. So what were your conclusions about decarbonization and electrification of the rail system? Is it going to strictly be an Eastern thing, and the West is going to, stay doing what they're doing, or how did you conclude things are going to evolve?
Yeah, so it's not going to be strictly an Eastern thing, but I think a lot of the metal consumption for rail infrastructure will be driven by the East, because that's where a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative from China is really the main driver of that. I think in Europe, we're still going to see further electrification and further implementation of high-speed rail. I think in the US, there's going to be a lot of probably failed attempts at pushing this through, depending on who gets in. If we have a Kamala Harris administration, then perhaps there'll be more funding for high-speed rail. But at the same time, that's going to come out of the taxpayers' wallet. So ultimately, the train and rail is not going to be a huge consumer of metal consumption, different to what cars and electric vehicles will be in the final segment of this series. But it's still going to, be chipping away at demand, and it's still going to ultimately exploit the dwindling supplies of these metals that we still don't have enough of. And we, perhaps it's already too late to avoid higher prices as a result of that, commodity prices.
Well, that doesn't sound overly positive, but like a lot of these things, it is what it is. And, the reason we're having this discussion is that it's not as simple as some people want you to believe it is, just to snap our fingers and make these things happen. So I appreciate your time and your research on these articles, and I look forward to part 3 coming up in our September issue, and we'll circle back with each other afterwards, and we'll put the podcast out to summarize what was written.
Perfect. As always, Mike, thanks for having me. Always good to do this.
If people want to follow your stuff, I understand you have a website. They can do so now.
Yes, it's tedjbutler.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Ted J. Butler. That's where I post most of my stuff. Same on Twitter, on X, Ted J. Butler. So feel free to check me out there and send me a direct message if you find anything interesting you want to say.
Wonderful. Again, thank you very much for your time, Ted. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.